So normally you turn up to an aerobatic comp, whatever category you're in, and you get given a sequence that you're going to fly. Well, hopefully you get given that some months in advance so you get a chance to practice it. But at any rate, someone else does the designing for you. And sometimes you're going to like that sequence and think it's nicely done and it suits you, it suits your aeroplane. Sometimes not. Sometimes quite the opposite. You might think I hate this sequence, so my aeroplane won't get around it. So that's the kind of thing I can tell you a little bit about. It's what makes a sequence suit a person, suit your aeroplane. And of course, if you're designing your own, you get to have some control over that. So we're of course looking at the known sequence here for the sportsman category. I can also talk a little bit about Aresti, the notation and symbols.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll go over this quickly and just shout out or put your hands up if there's any questions. Okay. Figure 1 a loop. No hands, no questions. Figure 2. So we've got a Cuban, 2 of 4. Just one thing. Names for these figures, of course. Some are obvious, everyone knows that. Some of them, when you get to the more interesting figures, the names can be a bit obscure. Doesn't really matter unless you're talking to someone else. If you're looking at it yourself, it can be a handy mental thing. I think more important is to know the names for the basic shapes, the basic elements, and especially the rolling elements. So anyway, figure 2 there, you see we've got the 2x4. Anyone not know what that means?
I'm assuming it means you do it in pieces rather than...
Yeah, so 2 of 4, you can think of it as a fraction. So if it was 4 of 4, that means a whole, or a 1 of 1, that means a complete roll. So 4 of 4 would be a complete roll, but with hesitations at the 90-degree points. So you've got four quarter rolls. So 2 of 4 is of course effectively a half roll to inverted, but with a hesitation halfway through. And then the notation is the 2x4.
There's another one where, like let's say that was 3 of 4.
Yeah.
There's another one where you don't hesitate. And what's that, like 3/4 or something?
3/4, yeah. And you can think of that as 3/4.
Yeah.
So usually the mental translation is with the slash, think of it as 3/4, and it's simply 3/4 of a roll with no hesitations. And the X means with hesitations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and of 4, of course, means
quarters.
Yeah, 90 degrees. That's right. Or you can have of 8, which is of course at 45s. And so an 8 of 8 would be a complete full roll with hesitations, or you could have a 4 of 8. Everyone going all right with that concept?
So the dash part, it means that you're upside down until you do the hesitation bits to get the right way up.
Exactly. So we're upright, coming in here. Now here, at this point here, we're not literally upright. Of course, you're inverted as you're halfway through a loop. The reason the line's still black is because you're under positive G. So the black versus red doesn't literally mean you're inverted. It means you're under positive or negative G at the time.
But the dash bit means you're inverted.
No, the dash bit means you're under negative G. So here you are both under negative G and you're inverted. But in some scenarios you'll see a dash line when you may in fact literally be upright. Yeah.
So for the clarification, that's when you start doing things like Humpties, you might be doing a pull, push, pull. So you pull to the vertical, then you're pushing over the top. So it'll be all dashed because you're upright, but you're under negative G going over the top.
Yeah, so that's an excellent example. You typically see that at sportsman category or perhaps intermediate category. So you pull to vertical, and here's the little plane. So you pull to vertical, you're going straight up. Instead of a traditional Humpty where you're pulling that way, now that way when you're inverted you're under positive G because you're pulling, or it might be close to 0. So in the notation it'll be a solid black line all the way, although you're upside down, but you're not hanging there. Anyway, you're still under positive G. But if you do pull to vertical and then a push, so here you're upright, but you're actually under negative G, or close to 0. But anyway, so in the notation in that scenario, it'll be dashed, yeah. And if it's colour, it'll be red. So anyway, that's figure 2. Figure 3 is a roll off the top. Any questions about that one? No. Figure 4.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
That's
right. Figure 4 is a 1-turn spin. So if you can go back to the sportsman one, if you just click on that sportsman tab.
Pull this over here so I can play with that.
Sure. So the spins, they use the little triangle as the notation. And the commonly seen spins, as in this case, it's a 1-turn spin, and you can also get a 1.5, or you can get a 1 1/4 and so on. It'll always be some multiple of a quarter. generally up to 2. Now, this one here, the spin's drawn halfway down the line. It's more conventional, and I find
I don't know why it's doing that.
it's just it's more conventional, and I think preferable to draw the spin close to the top of the line, because it more relates to physical reality. You know, you're dropping straight into the spin. This is more the arresting notation. You've got a base figure, which is from going horizontal to a vertical down to horizontal again, and then it's got a roll element on it called spin. Now that concept makes sense for most of, for the other kind of rolls, like the aileron rolls and the flick rolls, but for a spin it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But in terms of the way the figures are scored, that's literally what's going on. You've got a base figure, which is an L shape, kind of L shape, with a spin element added. So the software will stick the roll element halfway down, but you can adjust it and stick it up the top, which I'd recommend. Makes more sense. Anyway, one turn spin, so of course you come out in the same direction. Now,
Just a query of a spin, is it part of the finish of the spin to end up with?
Yeah, so that's judging criteria, and that's actually tricky with a one-turn spin, because the natural after a one-turn spin is you're going to be canopy up and wheels up, so you have to do what feels rather unnatural and push forward quite abruptly to make it. So a 1.5 is much easier to fly. 1.25 or 1.75, they're also tricky because you're finishing. And again, the criteria says you're supposed to be pointing straight down, but if you don't do anything about it, you're going to be skewed off, you're going to be yawed off the vertical. So after you stop the spin, you've got to put in, or simultaneously stopping it, you've got to put in heaps of rudder to fix that. I'm not going to, we could go on all day if we talked about flying and how to fly it accurately. But yeah, although it is relevant, definitely, because if you're designing your own sequence, you've got to think about what's easy for me to fly. And if you have a choice, as you often do, I'd recommend picking a 1.5 turn spin, because it's the easiest of all the spins to fly, rather than a 1 turn. And you'll have a higher K factor as well. Anyone not know what a K factor means? Anyone familiar? Okay, sure. So K factor is a difficulty factor. This complete sequence will have a total K, or a total difficulty factor. So for a sportsman sequence, the total K will be characteristic of your roundabout, whatever it is, 100 to 150 K, something like that. So each category will have its own typical K range, which is a rough indication of the difficulty level. And that's simply a sum of the K for each figure. And for the figure, the K is the sum of a standard K which comes out of the catalogue. For the base figure, plus there's a K for the roll elements. So when I say K, just remember that just means a number which represents the difficulty. And for the roll elements, the K will vary depending whether it's on a horizontal line, or in this case a 45-degree down line or a 45-degree up line. Generally, K is lower for horizontal, and similar for a 45-degree down. You have a higher K if you're on a 45 up, representing that it's more difficult to fly a roll element on a 45-degree up, and similarly on a vertical up, the K a bit higher as well. I know I'm changing the subject slightly. When you're designing a free, you have to choose the figures, meaning the base figures, and also the roll elements. There's also, the rules say you can't have duplication of figures, and that can really make it difficult, because that applies not just to the base figure, like you can't in the same sequence have two plain rolls, for example, but you could have, or say two Humpties, that's a good one. You can't have two identical Humpties, but you could in the one sequence have a push Humpty and a pull Humpty, because they're different figures. And when I say different figures, that's basically referring to the catalogue number. So each of these figures has a number that you see in the catalogue, and different figures has a different catalogue number. So anyway, this rule's about repetition. Spins, yeah. So that's plain half roll. Any questions? How do we know it's a half roll? Just because the arrow only extends from the centre of the line. And there's another half roll here, so that's on the down, and this is on the up. Now this is not actually a free sequence, so if someone's designing a known sequence, they're allowed to break these rules. You can have repetition either of a base figure or a roll element, but if you're designing your own free sequence, then you have to avoid repetition. And if you're using the Open Aero software, then it'll tell you, it'll give you little warnings telling you that you complied with this or that rule in terms of the sequence design. There's also mandatory elements. Depending on the category, you might be required to have a spin. You might say an intermediate. I think you're required to have a flick roll. Yeah, so go on.
Well, I'm just looking at the
Oh, sure.
naming the name.
Yeah. Where do we go? So here we've got a 270-degree turn, and we've got the full roll. Okay, any questions so far? All right, I'll get on to designing a sequence. So these days, common scenario is you've got to do what you call a free note. So that means that some number, maybe 5 of the figures, will be given to you. And in fact, at the moment, usually they come out of America or Europe. And so you've got to design a sequence of, say, 10 figures total, but 5 of them is given to you on a plate. And you have to choose another 5 figures, which has to fit in with the first 5, the standard 5. And you also have to meet the required total K factor, difficulty factor. And you've also got to comply with the various mandatory rules. You've got to include certain things, depending on the category. You might have to include different kinds of roll elements.
I was going to say, do you want to just
Oh yeah, so this is a good illustration. So you would have seen these, so this is your judge's score sheet, but it also illustrates that for each figure you have these numbers here.
I'll just go to the top so you can see what the names of the things are.
Yeah. So like it says here, catalogue number. So a plain loop has got that particular catalogue number. Remember I said I can't here teach you everything, I don't know everything anyway, about designing your own sequences, but I can help identify the tools that you can use. One of the tools is the catalogue, that's the Aerobatic catalogue. Now that, if you want a copy of it these days, you have to pay for it. You used to be able to download it for free. Unfortunately for the last 10 years or so, since the death of Colonel Jose Aerobatic, you can't get it for free anymore as a PDF online. It's an invaluable document, especially the first dozen or so pages, which describe the notation. And then after that, you've got the bulk of the catalogue, which is the list of figures. And both parts are really useful. Because the alternative, and people do get a long way without ever seeing the catalogue these days, which is a big pity, because it's a very handy document. Because otherwise, the other way to do it is simply to struggle with the software. When I say struggle with, it's not too bad, the Neuro software, but it's not for everyone, not everyone's cup of tea. But the problem is, it was really designed on the assumption that people were already familiar with the catalogue and they're just using a tool to make the process hopefully easier. But if you're not familiar with the catalogue, then the software can seem unintuitive and it's hard to know why certain things are the way they are and so on. Anyway, the Aerobatic catalogue, of course, was designed over the years by the Colonel himself and a great many other people in the international aerobatic community since around about the 1950s or 60s and so on. And it changed its form very much, but it's been fairly stable since I think around about the 90s with relatively minor additions. And like I say, the front 20 pages or so, if you can get a copy, if you want a copy, I can let you know where to find a semi-legal version. It would still be legal to grab an old copy anyway, predating, and most of it hasn't changed anyway, certainly the early stuff that explains the notation and stuff.
It's €18 for a A5 version.
What's that?
€18 for an A5 version. If you want an A4 version,
yeah,
it's 36.
Well, that's not too bad. Yeah, so yeah, go on, spring for it.
Yeah, you got cheap
Plus freight.
€1 or something.
Yeah. But really, no, I'm serious. It's worth having. It's invaluable. So it explains the notation. It explains the way the catalogue numbering works. The left-hand digit is the I forget the exact words. It's basically the section within the catalogue.
It's
so
the,
you have
the family, isn't it? They call it the family.
The family, that's right. Yeah. So you have the looping figures. 8, that's Cubans and possibly something else. So you can see here that's also 7. So that also lives in the looping figures. In that case, it's a half loop up. This section 1 is lines. So again, this is a bit peculiar because when you think about it, if you're flying it, you think about it simply as a spin. But the way it's defined in Aerobatic is you have a base figure, catalogue 1, and the lines, which is simply an L-shaped line. And of course, you're not literally flying, you're just flying straight along and then vertical down and then level, but that's the way the catalogue works. Anyway, that's another family 1 figure. Family 1 broadly is figures made up of straight lines. Anyway, notice here we have the number 9. So number 9 is roll elements. So 9.4 is the 4-point rolls, and 9.1 is the full rolls, or rolls without hesitation. So it's not actually a full roll, it's a part, but it doesn't have any hesitation. So 9.4 means it's a 4-point roll. Anyway, so you can learn a lot about how the catalogue numbering works by having a look at the catalogue. And also it teaches you all about the K factor, the difficulty factor, the way that works, which is very useful, because again, if you use the software, the Open Aero software, it'll do all that stuff for you, but you won't know why it does it. And it really can be annoying if you are struggling with it and things aren't making sense, and you don't have the background of how the stuff was designed in the first place. All right, let's see. You can see here, the next column over here is the K factor. That's that difficulty number I was talking about. So essentially, to find the K for a given figure, you just add up the K for the base figure and for the roll elements. And that can end up being quite a lot for a complicated figure with lots of roll elements. Yeah, so if you're designing your own sequence, like say for a free known, you need to be aware of the rules. These days though, mostly you're not doing it on a blank sheet of paper with a copy of the rule book in front of you. Remember I was talking about tools, that's the other thing that is invaluable along with the catalogue is the rule book. Now in New Zealand we have our own rule book of course. That is strongly based on the FAI rule book, the European one. At different times in New Zealand we'll follow the Americans, the ISE system, and more recently more towards the European. Anyway, each has their rule books, and in this respect they're pretty much identical in terms of how you're supposed to construct a free known. They're different in some other respects, especially concerning judging and some things to do with the way a competition's supposed to be run and so on. But with the judging and the bulk of the judging and also the bulk of the sequence construction are identical, so it doesn't really matter. You can find that is freely available, both obviously the New Zealand one, but also the European and American ones on which the New Zealand one's based. Very long, somewhat intimidating if you've never seen it before. And the thing is to pick on some detail, pick on some question that might be in your mind about how is a certain, it can get distracting as well because it overlaps with judging, and if you want to talk about how do you fly a particular figure correctly, like John was saying, after a spin, making sure that you're straight on the vertical line and so on, what are the judging criteria, that's a whole other area that you can lose huge amounts of time on as well, and plenty to learn if you're not familiar. But sticking with sequence design, the rules will tell you a great deal about that. And again, you can shortcut all that if you just dive into using the Aresti software, the Open Aero software. But you'll find it frustrating if you don't know what it's based on, because that'll implement the rules before you do. It'll complain and give you some little red lettering or something saying you haven't complied with this sort of rule. But if you don't know why, it's a frustrating exercise. So a copy of the rules and a good few hours in which to allow you time to study it is very handy too. So anyway, just broadly to cover the kinds of rules there are. There's the mandatory figures that you've got to include, which will differ depending on the category. There's the repetition, that you can't repeat either the base figures or the roll elements. And as I say with the roll elements, say you've got to spin a roll, like a simple single roll for 360 degrees. That's a different figure depending whether it's horizontal or vertical or 45 up to 45 degree down. So the repetition applies to the roll element being the same, but on a particular line. So you can have a roll on a vertical down and vertical up, that's not repeated. And the base figure repetition depends not just on the shape of the figure, but exactly what parts of it are positive or negative as well. So as I say, with the push humpty versus the conventional pull humpty, it'll have a different catalogue number and be a different figure. So especially with intermediate, humpties are a good choice of figure because the score's not great. Because remember, quite often you want to push the K up. You've only got 5 figures to put in, but you need to meet a certain K factor. If you just do 5 very simple figures, your K will be low, and your overall score, if you didn't do anything about it, will be lower than other people's free names, which is not desirable. So you've got to make the figures as difficult as they need to be to meet the K that you're trying to target. Does that make sense? Am I talking? Yeah. Okay, sure. So
So sorry, just on that, so you get a K limit that you can't exceed, but you want to try and push up as close to that as possible.
Well, ideally you want to hit it bang on, yeah. But it doesn't matter too much if you 1 or 2K under. Yeah, but I guess it's a point of pride to hit it bang on if you can. But essentially, every point that you're under that is points that you're throwing away. That means you're impossible for you to score. You're handicapping yourself. So, and the software can be very handy for that. In the old days, before the software, you do it all on paper and looking things up on the catalogue, and it was a very slow and painful exercise to design a sequence to meet a particular K, and using that open arrow is great for that, because you can just play around with it, mess around with it, and see, oh, I've gone a little bit over or under the target K, and just sort of swap rolls around.
And those mandatory figures, are they in a mandatory order, or can you put them in whatever order you like?
That's a good question. No, they're not in a mandatory order. You can put them in any order you like, and in particular, you can also put them into wind, downwind, or crossbox any way you like. Yeah. So, so say for example, when I did the free 9 that I'll be flying, assuming the weather cooperates later on, one of the mandatories, the way they drew it, implied the x-axis was one way, but I ended up using it the opposite way. I put it, I rotated it 90 degrees basically, which you're allowed to do. Yeah. So that's another thing. I'll just jump away from I've been talking very much about the rules, what you have to do, compliance and so on. Talk for a minute about what's desirable, about what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so about what's a nice sequence design. So I've talked about the constraints, what limits are on you. Now, first you want a sequence that suits you personally and your aircraft. So if you're in a pits, you don't want something that has got 720 degrees of rolls. Ideally you don't want so much aileron rolling, but you do want lots of flex, because pits are good at that. If you've got a low power aircraft, you want a sequence that conserves energy, of course. It's not an energy burner, naturally.
So let's just, for example, say you're trying to design a sequence for the sports and you're flying an alpha.
Yes.
What manoeuvres would you put in the first 3 or 4 manoeuvres that you consider using?
Yes. Well, that's put me on the spot. Let's see. So.
Just think, it can't do much.
Yes, of course.
We're not going to hold you to.
No, it's okay. So.
That's demonstrated.
That's all right. So first, I think for sports. You don't have the mandatory figures.
No.
I think you're simply able to.
You can design whatever you like. It's a completely free known. Yeah.
Yes, completely free known. But I would imagine you still have to meet a certain K number.
I don't think Andy's actually got. I don't think there is a K factor for the sports, is there?
There isn't a mandatory K.
Free known.
If you have a match,
Three, there is. There's a limit.
Oh, there is there.
There's a limit, yeah.
There's a limit, yeah.
There
Okay.
is a limit, Russell.
For sports, and is there
I know.
effectively a penalty if you go under the top?
Under the K?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Because. Yeah. All right. All right. Let's assume you've got a free hand and there's less of these constraints. You probably are still limited in terms of repetition. You probably still can't repeat
Yeah.
those. Right.
Spins, different types of rolls
Yeah.
as well.
Yep. Okay. And you'd be required to have at least one spin, I assume, for sports. Yeah. Okay.
I think there's everything, one from every family, Russell.
One from every family,
Yeah.
radio. So anyway, you need to familiarise yourself with those constraints. Obviously, you can tell I'm not familiar. And then, of course, you've got to ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? So, say it's a Robin. Of course, you want to conserve energy. So, you're probably going to lose height overall in the sequence. For sports, it's going to be 7, 8 figures. How many figures in the sports? 8 figures. Okay. You're probably going to need to start high and expect to work low. And so you want to think about what figures look good when you're higher up. Let's see, for a Robin, for 8 figures, you might even need to think about a mandatory break or an optional break. For sports, you're probably not going to get penalised. You want to put in, or at least anticipate that at a certain point in your sequence you might want to break, because you're getting low. When I say low, getting towards your bottom of your comfort zone. I don't mean literally low, because you've got to be aware that if you get even close to being low, it's going to affect your performance, and the judges are going to see it. You're going to be flying worse. You may as well break and fly up, and especially because of the lower categories, you're not going to get penalised for that. And it's definitely a sign of good airmanship, and the judges will appreciate it too if they see you making such a decision, rather than seeing someone who's struggling and is scraping near the bottom of the box and is obviously aware of it. So you're not going to penalise them completely, but you are going to question their judgment and not break it. If if you're a judge watching that kind of thing. Anyway, certainly the sequence design can affect that. So yeah, you want to think about what figures look good when you're higher up, and what figures look good when you're working closer to the bottom of the box. I'm sorry to be vague, but I can't actually say for sports in a Robin which figures are going to fit into either of those categories.
Just in your experience, what figures will you consider as energy sucking manoeuvres? Which ones are you going to lose most energy on?
Well, certainly flick rolls. You lose energy. Generally, it's good. A common thing to put in sports is a 45 degrees. So you have a straight line going in, and then a 45-degree up, and then a horizontal. People commonly put that as a prelude to a spin, because it's energy building. Basically, you can't sustain it indefinitely, certainly not in a Robin, but on the whole, it's going to be good for you. So let's see, the spin. Commonly, people will put that in as figure 2 for that reason, with exactly that. You can also do a vertical up and then horizontal and then you spin.
Yeah.
So that can work, putting the spin early, but it is going to use a lot of height, and you may have difficulty gaining that height back. A roll off the top can be an energy gainer, of course, but then if once you've done your roll off the top, you then generally want to do that at the downward end of the box, because you want to accelerate maybe for a good long time in a Robin to build up the speed for the next manoeuvre, and you want to be doing that into wind, of course. So yeah, there's a lot of people will tell you things about what kind of figures to put at the upwind or the downwind end of the box, and there's different reasons for it. One is that if you're accelerating from slow to fast, you obviously want to do that into wind. The shape of looping manoeuvres. So if you're doing a loop, conventionally people will say, well, sometimes people will say, oh, you hear the opposite thing. Some people say you should do the loop only running downwind, so that means that when you slow it over the top, you're heading into wind. But then that means you've got to float it. You've got to be conscious of it as you're getting there, because if you fly that the same way you would in nil winds, then it'll end up looking pinched, and you'll often get one of these loops that lots of people will see when you're on the judging line, where the first part of it looks okay, but then somebody gets slow, they're maybe not even aware that they're flying that part of the loop into wind, and then if they pull through at the normal rate, it's going to chop it off and have it like a loop at all. And the only way to fix that is to float it, maybe even pushing, so you're feeling quite uncomfortable, and you're sitting there hanging in your straps, trying to drive it and make the loop look round. Whereas if you do the opposite, say you're flying into wind, imagine this is the upwind direction, then as you go down here, the wind is pushing you along, and if you fly it naturally, it's going to tend to flatten across the top, and that's generally not such a bad effect as the opposite. So maybe that's why people say, fly your loop into wind. But either way, you can compensate for it. And it's a bit too, once you had a bit of practice at it, well, one thing, even if you're flying somebody else's sequence like a known, you don't have any choice about it. It's best to get familiar with flying the loop either way, and just be aware of what it looks like from the judge's point of view, so that you can design a sequence to suit yourself. Because really, an upward going looping manoeuvre, so that can be at either end of the box, is a very useful thing to put into a sequence, because it's energy building if you're doing a half loop up. And you really want to be able to do it at either end of the box, upwind or downwind ideally. So I'd say that's more something, rather than a sequence design thing, that's more of a training thing. Get familiar with doing a half loop up or a complete loop either way. When you're starting it, commencing into wind or downwind, just be aware of what it looks like from the judge's point of view. Best way to learn that is to get on the judging line, either as a judge yourself or as an assistant, and just see the awful shapes that people can turn loops into. Not through flying badly, just through not being aware of the effect of a headwind or a tailwind and what it does to the apparent shape of the loop from the point of view of the judges.
Has it ever been that a sequence has started with the spin before?
Oh yes, quite a lot, but not generally for sportsmen. So that's more, if you get a known sequence, then as you get higher in the categories, people designing knowns tend to get more sadistic and really try and make it difficult. And that's one of the nasty things that a sequence designer can do. Certainly if you design your own sequence, I do not recommend starting it with a a spin, because it means that you have to start very high and it's hard to judge it. Also, assuming you're doing an upright spin, you can't see. So how do you position yourself in the box? It makes it difficult. You have to, on your run, anticipate where you. Then as you're slowing, and most aircraft, unless you've got a nice clear panel below your feet, as you might in some planes, but for most of us, no, you don't know where you are. So as you're slowing, you've got to guess, and then you do your spin, and then you're horrified because your positioning's terrible, and it's also difficult to judge your height as well. So yeah, definitely don't do that deliberately, but you will encounter it in sequences designed by other people, either knowns or unknowns that might get thrown at you. Typically at advanced category or higher or intermediate wouldn't be immune from that either. Yeah.
So you were saying the half loop up is a good energy builder, but that's potential energy. You're going to come out of that slow, but higher.
Yeah. Well,
so you can't then go into say a stall
no, that's right. It's only an energy builder if you've got the opportunity to accelerate after that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, which means if that half loop's at the down end of the box, then you can accelerate after that, and even do another, maybe a stall turn after that. Although that might be a challenge in a Robin, but certainly in many sort of intermediate category aircraft, they'd be fine. To do a half loop up, accelerate, stall turn, or some other manoeuvre which basically means you're effectively doing two upward going manoeuvres in succession with an acceleration period in between. So,
and is it considered poor form to go from one side of the box to the other and have nothing in the middle? Or is that
not at all. Not at all. I mean, don't worry about poor form. All that matters, the judges are supposed to know. They're supposed to care about the judging criteria for the individual manoeuvres. What you're supposed to do, the aircraft's attitude and flight path and so on, and the way the roll elements. They're supposed to understand the judging criteria, and they're supposed to care about positioning as well, naturally. But provided you're within the box, and if you've got a bigger aircraft, you can get away with more, of course, because judges can see you from further away, and most judges aren't literally caring too much about whether you're in the box. They just want to know if you can see you. So if you're in a pits, that's more challenging. You've got to keep it closer. If you're in a yak, no worries.
So they can hear you, they don't need to
Yeah.
watch.
But I think what you bring up there, Mike, is a good point, because with the judging, you only judge from the straight level before the figure to the straight level at the end of the figure.
Yeah, okay.
All the figures start and end with
So
straight
if you get a
level.
break in between two figures, then bonus.
Well, you just finish that figure, the judges mark it, and they wait for the next one to start.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go, right, into the next
Yeah,
figure. Okay, so it doesn't matter the duration in between.
Yeah, indeed. So if you're doing a freestyle, Formula Free, then that sort of issue, the aesthetics, the flow and so on, is a criteria, but not for a competition sequence. It's not relevant. So judges will maybe get a bit flustered if the opposite problem happens, if you're rushing from one figure to the next. But it depends if it's justified. If there's no good reason for it, they might be irritated, but they're not supposed to take it into account. But you're going to make life harder for them because they have less time to get ready for the next figure, or to tell the pencil to write down the score and so on. But sometimes as a pilot, you've got no choice about that. If it's a fast flying sequence.
I was one of those candidates at the beginning that rushed everything
Oh yeah.
until Mike Slack come back from the judging line and blew me up.
Right. Yeah.
He absolutely swore at people. Just take it easy.
Yeah.
More time. Obviously.
Yes,
So
certainly. And
that helped.
Yep. And if someone's never done competition heroes before, they may have been taught a style where you do a continuous flow from one figure to the next, which is perfectly valid, but it's not competition heroes. So competition obviously is supposed to draw a line, not of any special duration, but a perceptible line in between figures. Yeah, so that's not necessarily rushing, that's more just doing a different style of aerobatics, which isn't strictly competition heroes, failing to draw the lines. All right, anyone want to point me in any particular direction with all this stuff?
One more question, sorry.
Yeah, no, go on.
Covered. So you said there was the three rules, the two international bodies and then New Zealand's own take on those.
Oh yeah.
That open aero thing applies to rules. Does that apply to New Zealand's rules?
Well, when you use open aero, you select the rules that you want. So
And New Zealand's an option, yeah?
it is an
Okay.
option, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you select, and the variations are pretty small anyway. It's more just if you're Googling and stuff, if you're trying to find a rule book, you'll find the New Zealand rule book. But in some areas it actually refers to the rules, or in some other areas it's copy and pasted. anyway, generally with the stuff in sequence design, doesn't matter which, you'll be fine.
With Open Aero, the New Zealand Aerobatic Club tell the users of, or the operators of Open Aero, what our rules are and what changes are, and then they've actually got a category in there. You can go select New Zealand AC. It's all in there.
Do you want to bring it up, Russell? Open Aero.
No, we're going to do it in another discussion.
Yeah. So, yeah, this, what I've been talking about is constrained to just the generic ideas of sequence design. I've touched hardly on how to actually fly the sequences, but it is important to be aware of what you do well and what your aircraft does well, and choose the figures accordingly. Or if you're obliged to fly a difficult figure, then put it perhaps at a time, maybe put it earlier in the sequence when you're fresher, more onto it. Don't put it last. That's the other thing. You can save the easier figures to last, the ones you're more confident of flying well. Yep.
There's never an opportunity to build a greater score through complexity of order of manoeuvres. It makes no difference the order on your final score potential.
No, the order doesn't affect it. It's just simply a total. The way the K factor works. The order doesn't make any difference to the score. So both and within an individual figure, the only thing is the roll elements. The K will differ depending whether it's horizontal, vertical up, vertical down, 45 up, 45 down. And also from inverted as well, I forgot to say. So a roll like from inverted to inverted. Oh no, sorry, no. Scratch that. No, it's the same K. But broadly, being inverted, if it's the base figure at least, being inverted will have a higher K, and hesitations have a higher K. So if you do, like say, a 4-point roll compared to a straight roll, then it'll have a higher K. 2-point roll will have a higher K than a 1, and so on. Another thing you get advanced above is combination rolls, where you might have, say, a roll followed by an opposite roll. So you might have like a half roll for inverted and then a 2 or 4 back to upright. And again, the K is largely cumulative for that sort of thing.
Here's the unlimited, Russell.
Oh, sure.
You should know this.
51K for one thing.
So this is unlimited.
That's our whole short.
You just do that one.
All right, so I can talk about this one a little bit. So this is not a free known. This is the
This is your known.
Yeah. This is the known sequence. So every figure is mandatory. I don't have any choice about it. And so this shows a number of elements that you would not put in a free known.
But the whole thing is you can see the portions of the figure are all listed there in their family sequence, then the Ks, and that's obviously the total K for the figure.
So how many families are there?
9.
9, yeah. 9. Although I think 1 or 2 of them are unused these days because there's been some change, been a couple of changes. Like spins used to be their own family, and then they got the rule book shuffled and they became part of the roll elements. So a couple of differences.
Do you want me to just go to the main diagram?
I can just sure. No, that's good.
No, whatever you want.
No, scroll down. So I'll just point out a couple of things about this. So you see here, that's a double roll. So you've got 2 arrows. So the basic roll is the arrow that crosses across the line, and you see there here you've got 2 of them. So that means 720 degrees of roll.
Does the little dash on top of the arrow mean anything?
It just means that these 2 are connected. So it's
continuous.
It's a single element made of 720 degrees of roll. Whereas here you've got opposite rolls. So you've got a full roll, and then you've got a double roll. And note the arrowheads are on opposite side of the line. That means the rolls have to be in opposite direction, with a small hesitation in between.
You can go left or right. The first one can be left or right, but the other ones have to be opposing.
That's right. So the first one can be left or right, the second one has to be opposite the first one. And so here we've got another pair. So the first is a 2-point roll. So that, of course, we're doing a half loop up. So we're inverted. We do 1, 2, and then we've got a negative 1.5 flip. And that also has to be in the opposite direction. So the arrowhead's opposite the top of that flip. So that's 1, 2, and then a negative 1.5 flip to upright. Finishing upright, we can see that because it's a black line afterwards. If it was the red dash line afterwards, that would mean we'd be finishing.
But who would fly a crazy thing like that?
Well, who would design it? So anyway, like I said, this is not a free known. I haven't designed this. This is one that gets inflicted upon on the victim, and then we got another 1.5 flick here. So there's a 2-point roll up. So that is the same as that. It's just the first one is on a horizontal line, and this one's on a vertical up. So 2-point roll.
So that would be all right if you were designing it yourself because they're on different lines.
That's right. It wouldn't be a duplicate. Whereas that and that are the same element, because this here is also, although it's on a loop, it's still counted as being on a horizontal line. So this is a known, so you can do what you like, but if it was a free known, that would be a violation of that duplication rule. Yeah.
So that 2 for the 2-point roll, that would be the same as a 2 by 2,
Correct.
2x2.
Yes, that's right, yeah, indeed.
And so where those numbers are going to be the same, they just omit the x.
That's right, yeah, it's the same with the 4-point roll, it's just a 4, meaning, yeah, quite right, yeah. So
There's not 4 rolls, it's 1 roll with 4 stops.
One roll with
for the entire
hesitation,
roll.
so that's, yeah, one complete roll with the hesitation, or the 4 would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is a vertical roll. Sorry, that's a plain roll, but it's on the vertical down. And that is the 3 or 4, so that's basically 3/4 of roll, but with the hesitation. So that's on the vertical up. So you've gone through the Humpty. This is an upside down Humpty, or depth charger, they're sometimes called. So you've gone down and then up, so you're on the vertical up, and you're going 1, 2, 3, and so you're finishing crossbox, and then you're pulling, so you're coming out inverted crossbox here, and then you're dropping into a 1 1/4 spin, negative spin.
Now those crossbox manoeuvres, you can do them any direction you want.
Quite right, yeah. So for today, because the wind's blowing towards the judges, I would do that as a right one. So this is an away manoeuvre. 1, 2, 3, and then pull. So that means I'm heading crossbox away from the judges. Because you can make this line as long as you like, because you're heading away from the judges, and you can, but you've got a good view of the ground, you're upside down, so you can position yourself well, get over to the other side of the box, and remember which foot you're supposed to use for the spin, which in this case is the right foot. So you do the 1 1/4 spin, then a half roll opposite, and then into the next. So this one's another pair, so you've got a you've got a positive 3/4 snap and then a 3 or 4. So what else is unusual about this from a notation point of view? You've got a tail slide here, it's a canopy up tail slide. So that's just comes crossbox, so you're going perhaps towards the judges, pulling up, tail slide, and then a 3/4 flick back to the interwind direction.
I just remember when I was starting to learn these things, what I found really hard was the numbers, because they didn't really make any sense.
Sure.
So it was really good we've talked about the fractions and the portions of a roll, and also the arrows, off the line it's half a roll. If it goes through the line, it's a full roll.
Yes, well, off the line it can be a quarter as well, so it means less than a full. So for a quarter, a half, or a 3/4, then the arrow only goes half the line.
Yeah.
So if it's a full roll or greater, then the arrow goes. No examples on the. Oh, here we go.
Same with the flick, is it? Because
That red triangle at the bottom?
Quite right, yeah.
Yeah.
So if it's less than a full roll, then the triangle is only on one side of the line.
Yeah.
So that 1 1/4 there.
1 1/4, that's right. Yeah. So it shows the.
And it's got the line saying it's combined, so it's
Yes.
1 1/4 and 1.
Yep. Yeah,
Altogether.
a single 1 1/4 flick. Yeah.
If the line wasn't there, you could do one flick, then a half flick.
Yeah.
But now you've got to do 1 1/2.
1
1 1/4, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the red means negative for the flicks as well.
Yeah.
So the white means it's a positive flick.
And in figure 9 there, you're going around there from straight and level, pulling to the 45, doing those figures.
Yeah.
Then from the 45, then you're pushing to the vertical.
Yeah. So do it with a little toy. So you got up to 45, quarter to knife edge, just momentary. 3/4 to, so you're still on the up 45, but you're inverted. Push into vertical, quarter roll. So you cross box, stool turn, that way, like having stool turn, and then 1 1/4. So you're going that way because you want to come this way. So you're going that way, around 1 1/4, that way, and the last figure, which is I don't know the name of this one. You get this is in I think it is family 8. Anyway, just forget. So there you got the negative half flick, and then the 8-point roll, inverted to inverted. Yeah.
And then it's an 8-point roll at the end of that.
Yeah, just the 8-point roll. Yeah, just and the trick with that is you're slow, but you've got to make the hesitations obvious to the judges, who may be a long way away. So you really want to exaggerate them. Anyway.
And that's what Andy was saying when I was critiquing him. He says it's really hard to do that in the pits because you've got such a short wingspan that the judges don't really see the wings moving much because it's a very small movement. Where you've got something with a bigger wingspan, it's much easier to see.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Mo gives me crap about is I tend to load up the first figure with a lot of K.
Oh, yes.
And he says, don't do that, Fred. Try to keep the Ks even throughout your free.
Yes, so that's that's common advice, and it's good advice to keep the Ks even, but it's not. You don't have to be completely religious about it. The rationale there is that if you screw up any one figure, you're more likely to screw up a high K figure because it's more difficult, and then you've got more to lose. Whereas if you spread out the K as evenly as you can across all the figures, then you've got less to lose. Well, first the difficulty is going to be roughly proportional, but you don't have to be super. Sometimes you get a figure that's, although it's high K, for you or your airplane, or just the vagaries of the Aresti system, is not actually that hard to fly. So no problem with having those in there. And as for earlier or later in the sequence, I think generally it's better that a more difficult figure, but difficult meaning one difficult that you perceive as being difficult to fly, that you put that earlier while you're still fresh and don't save it till the end. Again, that's pretty common.
And then the other advice he gave me is try to put the verticals upwind and the roundy things down.
Yeah, that's right, I agree. The roundy thing down, the round ones, especially the half loops up, downwind we talked about as being a good idea because you're building energy flying upwind. The verticals upwind is a good idea, and a strong wind because you're going to get blown back towards centre box, which is a lot better than getting blown out of the box downwind. But with these things, as with everything, you can't achieve all these goals at once. So sometimes you're obliged to break one rule or another. But yeah, where possible, certainly, the verticals upwind. Another common one is crossbox manoeuvres, which you're not going to get so much in sportsmen. You might get a crossbox in sportsmen.
You've got a
A little bit,
yeah. So, but definitely intermediate and above, you get crossboxes and they become more significant. Again, common wisdom is to put the crossboxes pretty much always come in pairs, although you can get obviously a 180-degree turn, that sort of thing. Or you can get a Humpty crossbox, that gives you a little bit of crossbox, maybe just a few hundred metres. They're good to have as well because you can choose to do the Humpty as a very tight one and therefore not gain or lose too much, or you can do, provided you've got the performance, you can do a big, maybe gain 400 metres crossbox. So yeah, they're handy, but most commonly crossbox figures come in pairs. So. And the crossbox portion of it is most commonly high energy. So your first figure will finish low and fast, and then you'll do a second half of that pair, or you'll enter it fast, and you might come out either fast or slow for the second of those. And again, common wisdom is you put that crossbox pair at the upper end of the box. What's the rationale for that? Generally helps for positioning. Again, with the crossbox, you've typically got two verticals, or at least two verticals, one after the other. So if you've got a strong wind, then you're going to be drifting, and so you're better off drifting back towards centre box rather than drifting further away downwind. So perhaps that just comes under the category of putting your verticals upwind if you can.
And then he also gives me grief when I put all my cross boxes together. I said, spread them out so you can work your way. Where you want to be.
That's right. Yeah, another bit of common wisdom is to have a maximum of, say, 4 or 5 figures in between your crossbox pairs. So for a typical sequence length of about 10 figures, that means you want to have at least one crossbox about in the middle of the sequence, or if you can, two crossboxes, two crossbox pairs, one maybe a third of the way in, another one towards the end. Again, with all the stuff, you can't satisfy all of these criteria all at once. There's just too many different conflicting demands, especially when you factor in not just the things that you want in the sequence, but there's also all the constraints, the stuff I talked about to start with, all the rather long list of rules that limit what you can do. So it's impossible to satisfy everything.
That's really good, Russell.
Yeah. Any more questions, or?
Just rounding off, what are your top 3 pieces of advice for anyone designing their first sequence?
Sure, I'd say treat this not as a real bit of education that's going to make any difference, but just as a prompt to go out and do your own research. Get a hold of the catalogue if you can, or at least the first few pages. If you're in the mood, grab a copy of the rules. You might not stay in the mood all that long, but anyway, have a go at it. And also have a go with the Open Aero software. But I would caution you against relying only on the Open Aero software if you're not familiar with the catalogue or the rules. Because each of these things has its own difficulties and sources of frustration. But if you tackle all three, if you have a catalogue or a good read, especially the introductory material of it, and the rules or a portion of it, and have a bit of a play with the software at least, then you'll have a lot more joy than tackling any one of those alone. As for 3 bits of advice, first one is don't bother unless you've got some motivation. All right, because it's unless you're inclined for a certain sort of mental puzzle solving thing, it can be a difficult and frustrating exercise, and you're only going to do it if you've got some reason to. Which basically I would say it's optional, like say it's sportsman and you have a choice about it, then tell everyone you know that you're going to design your make it a matter of personal pride and commit yourself to serious embarrassment if you don't follow through, whatever works for you. Yeah.
Right.
So that's what I'd say is the main thing. Yeah. You use tools, go and dig up the tools, and give yourself some source of motivation, because it's not going to be 100% fun.
For sportsmen though, you have to match the K of the known if you're going to do a free, and the reason is people fly known, known, known.
Yeah.
And then the other guy flies known, known, unknown.
Yes.
Or free, and they have to match up with the scores.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that could be a good motivation if you're serious about trying to win sportsman, because you may see that the the standard sequence doesn't suit you or your aircraft. You may feel that you could do better, and quite possibly you could, and so that could give you a big advantage. As compared to, say, intermediate or above, where you're designing a free known because you have to, because all the competitors have to. But if you've got a choice about it, then that could definitely give you a competitive advantage.
And it's your free known, it's just yours, isn't it? No one else is flying that, and you're not flying anyone else. It's like you.
Correct. That's
You
your own design.
can practice it prior and all those things.
Yeah, that's right. And so, although you might steal somebody else's free known.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or parts of it.
Or parts.
So do they ever have a thing where everyone sort of collaborates to end up in I suppose that would be an unknown, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the way all this has worked has changed quite a bit over the years. The free knowns are a relatively new innovation, and yes, the way unknowns used to be designed is the competitors would all get together and produce an unknown sequence that all of them would then be obliged to fly the same one. But the rules have changed now, and basically multiple competitors can do that, and you then can choose which one you're going to fly. But I've only done that once a couple of years ago. Yeah, so anyway, but the free known seems to be something that's going to stick around.
That's cool. Thank you, Russell.
For
those who are interested, the next weather event we have, where we get held up, I've asked Andy to actually go through and explain using Open Aero, because that itself is a whole mind job.
Sure.
It's one of those programs you're better off starting off actually knowing your sequence that you want to build and put it in there as almost an audit function of it to make sure it fits.
Yeah, I'd recommend if you're going to design a sequence, just do it on paper first, even if you're not at all sure about what you're going to do. And then, when you turn to the software, try and use it as a tool to record the sequence that you've already put down on paper. Certainly you can use Open Aero to design a sequence when you've got absolutely nothing in your brain whatsoever, and you're just entirely free.
I think you'll want to be on a fay how it works quite well. You'd want to know how the program works and all that before you start.
Yeah, so I personally, I don't like it that much, because I just find it frustrating from a user interface point of view, so I struggle with it somewhat. But if someone, but that's largely because I don't use it very much, use it very often, just as infrequently as I can really, but also because I'm old school, But yeah, certainly if you spend a lot of time getting to grips with it, then you might find yourself very free and intuitive with it and so on, and perhaps you could not bother with figuring stuff out. You could freeform it a lot better. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Russell.
Right.
Anyone got any more questions?